Welcome to No Apologies. I'm Dana Lash. In the campaign to fight the coronavirus pandemic, there have been some real messaging gems. Slogans right up there with "Got milk, just do it, and yo quiero Taco Bell." Zingers like 15 days to slow the spread, or how about stop the surge on our hospitals? And who can forget, we're all in this together. Now, all of these slogans crashed and burned, of course, totally discredited not long after they were penned. 15 days to slow the spread died a super fast death. But thankfully, that's morphed into now, no one must ever get coronavirus ever again. Stop the surge on our hospitals, the original reason for the whole 15 days to slow the spread slogan. Well, that outdated tagline, that was used as the reason for the original lockdowns. It never even comes up anymore. No one talks about it. And why hold on to that really unambitious stop the surge on the hospital idea when the whole entire goal should be to eradicate viruses from planet Earth altogether so no one will ever get sick? Just take the vaccine, as St. Anthony Fauci says, and the Garden of Eden returns and we all have eternal life. Amen. In any case, just when you thought that all of the hyperbolic taglines for coronavirus imaginable had already been thought out and put out there, just when you thought that the clever writers in the Biden administration were all out of ideas, that's when the big idea hit. The coronavirus slogan to rule them all. The most viral of all of the virus slogans that will finally convince all of those dumb Trump people to finally get injected. So utopia can begin and sickness can be banished into the distant past. Well, we don't actually know for sure, but maybe the idea dawned on Jen Psaki, or more likely some Biden administration writer, like a bolt from the blue. All the best ideas come that way, as all creative people know. As soon as they heard the words, they probably thought, how did we miss it? It was right in front of us the whole time. Those shame-filled words that would finally make people want to take the experimental vaccine. The same way "I'm loving it" made people want a Big Mac. The magic slogan, are you ready? The pandemic of the unvaccinated. Nated. Just rolls off the tongue, right? And right on cue, as if a White House ad agency sent the slogan out to just very obedient Democrat media that acts basically like a PR firm for the Democrat Party. Suddenly everyone said those magic words that will go down now in pandemic marketing history, all at the same time. Don't believe me? Watch.
We still have a lot of people not vaccinated. The pandemic we have now is a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
This is becoming a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
This was always a pandemic of the unvaccinated. From the beginning, it was a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
So while this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated, there are millions of children who can get sick because adults won't do something to protect them.
It is the pandemic of the unvaccinated, because that is why we're seeing this variant really taking over in hospitals right now.
They're killing people. I mean, look, the only pandemic we have is among the unvaccinated.
This is now a pandemic of the unvaccinated. It is now a pandemic of choice. The choice not to get vaccinated.
This is now a pandemic of the unvaccinated, so we need people to get vaccinated. We have seen an acceleration in the number of people getting vaccinated, which is good news, but we need more.
It is a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
What is happening in America right now is a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Let me say that again. It's a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
You know how he wasn't going to say that originally when he was out there getting ready to get on, I guess, Marine One. And he's like, well, they're killing people. You could almost hear someone screaming in his ear, no, that's not your line. Imagine your pride, though, if you were the young writer who came up with a slogan, and after watching everyone say these magic words, including the President of the United States, right, you probably felt good about yourself. Now, if you wrote this slick slogan, you would think pandemic of the unvaccinated is going to be bigger than the NFL's recent campaign, football is gay. And if so, you too would be standing on a stage receiving an advertising Clio award or an Emmy, just like Cuomo did for his super awesome coronavirus press conferences. Andrew Cuomo, governor of New York, right? Even as he put infected old people back in convalescent homes and just had them there with coronavirus patients, which ultimately killed thousands of senior citizens. Now, fast forward to yesterday. Imagine what that felt like. In fact, imagine what the whole White House felt like yesterday when the magic slogan, pandemic of the unvaccinated, that should have led to the Coronavirus Advertising Hall of Fame and the end of the coronavirus. Imagine when you booted up your computer that morning in the White House, ready to write your next memorable tagline. But before you do, you see this headline from the New York Times. Quote, Behind the masks, a mystery. How often do the vaccinated spread the virus? Hold up. The first thing you would think, because you believe in science, is that's hearsay. Vaccination is the key to ending the entire pandemic. Everyone knows that. Everyone said so. The president, the Surgeon General, the CDC, everyone said that like yesterday. We know that they can't be wrong because the government's never wrong. And that was the brief for your awesome slogan that you wrote, pandemic of the unvaccinated. So it must be true. The pandemic is the unvaccinated people's fault. I mean, that's how vaccines work. Your vaccine doesn't work unless the person who next to you that's unvaccinated, their vaccine works. And then it powers up your vaccine. How many times do I have to say vaccine for YouTube to ban me? All we have to do is get vaccinated and then the pandemic ends. Everything goes back to normal. Then we can stop masking indoors and kissing people through masks like Kamala Harris and her husband. We don't have to wear masks and face shields like they did in Philippines when they touched down. But then you scroll down the article, right, that New York Times piece, and you see these words staring at you in 12-point black and white Helvetica saying, the unvaccinated are getting and spreading the Delta variant. Now, from the same article in the New York Times, quote, some of the research may be related in part to an outbreak in Provincetown, Massachusetts, where 4th of July festivities have led to 882 cases as of Thursday. Nearly 3/4 of those people were fully vaccinated, end quote. 882 people got the Delta virus, the Delta coronavirus, the Delta strain, whatever. And 75% of them were vaccinated? If you wrote that pandemic of the unvaccinated line, you'd be gagging on your twice filtered, I don't know, artisanal blend, which is $6 a cup, by the way. What, the Sumatran blend at Starbucks, like your over roasted beans? Okay. So what exactly is going on here? The New York Times, as you know, never lies. Well, at least you think, but you better go fact check them. Don't tell anyone about it because you'll lose your cool kid points. At the Washington Post, that other completely and totally reliable news source. And that's when you see this headline, out of all places, from the Washington Post. What gives? The headline's this: the war has changed. Internal CDC document urges new messaging, warns Delta infections likely more severe. So you continue to scroll down again and you read this next with a mix of horror and sadness. And I quote, milder breakthrough infections may not be so rare after all, and that unvaccinated individuals are transmitting the virus. The agency must move the goalposts of success in full public view, end quote. Your Sumatran blend is cold now. You're not even drinking it. You scroll down a bit further and your head is spinning and you realize it may be time to stick a fork in your precious tagline, if not the next electrical outlet. Pandemic of the unvaccinated. Because the Washington Post article goes on to quote epidemiologist Jeffrey Shaman, who said this in an email after reviewing the CDC slides, and I quote, I think the central issue is that vaccinated people are probably involved to a substantial extent in the transmission of Delta. In some sense, vaccination is now about personal protection, protecting oneself against severe disease. Herd immunity is not relevant. What? As we are seeing plenty of evidence of repeat and breakthrough infections, end quote. Yeah, your mind's full on reeling now. And you think, so vaccination isn't the key to herd immunity after all? That's what we were told, right? We're going to get herd immunity. Have we given up on that idea? And also, is there anything that you can do, I mean, you personally, to salvage your amazing pandemic of the unvaccinated line? Because that was like really good. And who was the dumb White House strategist that told you the pandemic was all of the unvaccinated people's fault? Of course, you suspected at the time that it was just all another way to distract, to distract from the Biden administration's incompetence by blaming the pandemic on those evil, unjabbed Trump people, the Trumpkins. Quick. Maybe you could change the line from pandemic of the unvaccinated to maybe pandemic of the anti-science people or something like that. Like, I'm sure it'll come to you. Because really, the only thing stopping us from moving on from this whole sordid mess is people who refuse to just follow the science, which means only listening to Dr. Fauci and Rochelle Walensky of the CDC. In fact, here's some of Rochelle Walensky, CDC head, dropping some science on those uneducated Trumpkins in flyover country, explaining how more kids die from COVID than the flu. Watch.
I think it's really important for people to understand that this is not a benign disease in kids compared to other diseases that our kids see. So if you look at the mortality rate of COVID just this past year for children, it's more than twice the mortality rate that we see in influenza in a given year.
Okay, but you know that Walensky's claims have already been debunked by her department, the CDC's own data. Yeah, because the CDC's own data that they published on the internet in public shows that way more kids die of influenza than coronavirus each year. So what is this young writer in the Biden administration writing coronavirus slogans to do? Who can you trust? How are you supposed to write award-winning coronavirus slogans to get people to obey Dr. Fauci and Rochelle Walensky when they don't even seem to know their own data and they're always changing their minds? And that's when Fauci's latest confusing take on the coronavirus and vaccines shows up in your blasted Twitter feed. Watch.
Now that we have a Delta variant, that has changed the entire landscape, because when you look at the level of virus in the nasopharynx of a vaccinated person who gets a breakthrough infection with Delta, it is exactly the same as the level of virus in an unvaccinated person who's infected. That's the problem. So those data are very compelling, and that triggered the change in the CDC guideline.
And there you have it, the very quick and untimely death of your amazing coronavirus slogan, pandemic of the unvaccinated. Of all the slogans written about the coronavirus pandemic, this one crashed and burned faster and harder than any of them. It burned so bright, but all that's left now is for you to mourn the loss of so much potential. Those magic words, pandemic of the unvaccinated, could have turned everyone against the unvaccinated, treating them like lepers, socially stigmatizing them so badly that they would finally cave, get jabbed, and the pandemic might have finally come to an end. And then we could all finally have that 4th of July gathering next year. You know, the one that Joe Biden promised, with a couple of hot dogs you save 16 cents on, enjoyed while socially distancing, wearing 6 feet of masks with 2 or 3 of our closest relatives. I mean, be seriously, mask on, mask outside. I mean, don't get carried away. I mean, this is a pandemic after all. But it looks actually like the pandemic of the unvaccinated is just entirely extinct in just 7 short days. But such is science, and we must follow the science. And if it wasn't depressing enough already that you're a pandemic of the unvaccinated tagline just crashed and burned, it's clear now people who are vaccinated, and this is Fauci saying this, YouTube fact checkers, that the vaccinated spread the virus just as much as the unvaccinated. And then you see this article also from USA Today. The headline says, and I quote, breakthrough, COVID-19 infections after vaccination can lead to long-haul symptoms, Israeli study shows. In the piece, it goes on to say, quote, nearly 3% of medical workers in a new Israeli study contracted COVID-19 even though they were vaccinated, and 19% of them still had symptoms 6 weeks later. Although the vaccines were never expected to be perfect, the findings raise questions about their protection and suggest that even vaccinated people could experience long-term symptoms such as fatigue, brain fog, and shortness of breath, end quote. So imagine that. The vaccinated can not only also spread coronavirus, but they can also develop long-haul COVID-19 symptoms. Man, when it rains, it pours. Now, it's at that particular point, you wonder, as the creator of the pandemic of the unvaccinated tagline, you might be wondering why you even got vaccinated at all. I mean, because you're likely not to get very sick if you get the Delta variant, the CDC says, except there's some studies that say that, but there are also some studies that say that breakthrough infections that occur after vaccination, which appear to be pretty common, that can lead to the long hauler symptoms, and that's according to the USA Today article. So what do you do if you're the person who figured out that dream slogan, pandemic of the unvaccinated? And that's when it hits you, like a bolt from the blue. Remember, the best ideas are always that way. What if you just changed one little thing? What if you just scratched out a couple of letters in your magic coronavirus slogan, and voila, your magic coronavirus slogan is fixed, good as new, and likely just as accurate as your old tagline, pandemic of the unvaccinated, which was shown to be entirely completely false in just a few short days. But I digress. Time to kick your feet up and bask in the glow of your new inspired coronavirus slogan, pandemic of the vaccinated. Of course, something tells you that the Biden administration and the CDC and Fauci, they're not going to like this version very much, and you're not going to get any awards. Why? Because it doesn't blame the whole pandemic on unvaccinated Trumpkins, which means it probably won't fly with the Biden White House, because this is about Trumpkins. I mean, science. But that's okay, you tell yourself. After all, advertising campaigns, even ones about pandemics, aren't necessarily about the truth. They're about hyperbole, designed to get you to do what the advertiser wants, not what's best for you. And obviously the Biden administration, they don't care about what's best for Americans, because people are pouring over the border with coronavirus anyway, and they're not doing anything about it. I like Lindsey Graham's little mask that said "Mask the Border." I just wish he had been more dramatic about rolling out that slogan. That's a good slogan. No one said that writing pandemic messaging for the CDC and the Biden administration would be easy. Constantly changing briefs, bad data, just no transparency, endless contradictions. But that's just the way it is in the coronavirus messaging biz. I mean, science. Anyways, here's always tomorrow, right? You always have tomorrow. And the next big idea and the next big coronavirus mantra that everyone is supposed to believe, it's still on the horizon. And besides, you remind yourself, you still have a big idea in your back pocket. Lockdowns. Look at it. Lockdowns. I'm loving it, right? Yeah? And you're pretty sure that the Biden administration is going to go crazy for that slogan. In fact, it feels like they might try to roll that baby out pretty soon. Just a hunch. So are we at America's breaking point? Next up, Biden's overreach, tech censorship, border hypocrisy, and a lot more with our next guest, Bryan Dean Wright. Keep it here. So it feels like we're heading towards a breaking point in this country. Mandated vaccinations, big tech censorship, border hypocrisy, and it's all coming to a head. Bryan Dean Wright is an opinion writer. He's also a former CIA officer, and he joins us now. Bryan, you've talked a lot about this. It's good to have you join us. You've discussed this quite a bit, and I wanted to bring this, and I know you've seen this. This was from CNN. This was a tweet from CNN just a bit ago, part of their piece that they had on this new guidance from the CDC. They write, quote, "Vaccination alone won't stop the rise of variants, and in fact could push the evolution of strains that evade their protection," researchers warn. They said people need to wear masks, take all the preventative steps. So I'm looking at this thinking, so vaccinations aren't going to work until everyone has a vaccination. Am I reading this correctly? What is your take on this?
Well, it's quite the motivator, isn't it, for those of us out in the general public who don't have MDs or PhDs to try to figure out what in the heck is going on. We've been told repeatedly, haven't we, that we should be getting those vaccines, that we won't get sick, and if we do, it won't be very many of us, and we won't spread it very much, etc. So now we're getting all kinds of mixed messages. So I think what I'm seeing, and I think most people watching this program are seeing, is a President Joe Biden who has completely lost his mind and unfortunately is committing one of the most egregious public policy sins that we've ever seen in terms of health policy. I can't think of a more disastrous way to handle the vaccine rollout or the conversation that needs to take place with the American people about really the pros and the cons of the vaccine, that it's really a therapeutic, and that ultimately people need to work with their doctors to decide their own personal risk and then what path they ought to choose.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And also the other question, and this has not been addressed in any of the CDC, any of their updated texts about the new guidance, the administration hasn't addressed this. The way that it's being presented, Bryan, is that maybe the vaccine actually helped trigger mutations a lot faster. So instead of, this phrase, the pandemic of the unvaccinated, I mean, really, maybe how much did this vaccine contribute to all these new mutations that are out there?
Well, the short answer is we don't know, do we? Because one of the things that unfortunately happened is that the CDC, as of May 1st, stopped collecting data on these breakthrough cases that are happening from those folks who are vaccinated. So we don't know how many people really are contributing to this pandemic, and we don't know if those folks are vaccinated or unvaccinated because we're not looking for the evidence. So I wish I could answer that question. I wish somebody in this country could answer that question. But we don't have the data. Nobody's collecting it. It's crazy.
Yeah, and I don't understand this agency. I mean, it's a public health agency, and we're in a period where I don't know if ever public trust in any kind of agency has ever been as low as it has now. And people who very justifiably don't have trust in these agencies. They're the ones being shamed for the lack of transparency that they themselves can't provide, because it's agencies like the CDC, like for instance, that 335 number, when they were trying to say that this is out of 75 whatever million, here you have 335 fatalities of children with coronavirus. Well, then you had Wall Street Journal with a researcher from Johns Hopkins come out and say, none of you people looked at these cases. Every single one of those cases had a serious comorbidity like leukemia. That to me is irresponsible. Why are we giving this entity our tax dollars if this is the best we get?
Oh, listen to you talking about facts and reason and logic. My goodness, what a crazy idea. I have to tell you, this is one of the things that I have seen, as I'm sure you and so many of us have seen. We're not having a conversation, are we, about facts, about reason, about the thoughtful analytical conclusions from the data, right? We're talking about our feelings. We're talking about the fact that we're scared and what should we do based on the fact that we're scared. That's not how you run public health policy, but that is in fact what we're doing now. Let's toss one other element in there and that I can speak to quite personally. I've had COVID, I've recovered from it. I had a very terrible experience, in fact, oddly so. I'm not obese, I'm not 65 and up, which typically are your risk factors. But bad stuff, unfortunately, did happen to me, but I've recovered. And there are lots of great pieces of data that says people like me don't need to get the vaccine. In fact, there was a study that came out 2.5 weeks ago from the NIH, or at least it was funded by the NIH, Emory University put it out, that said my immunity is both durable and strong. So if in fact that's the case, where's that conversation in all this? Should we be talking about that? Because that number of people, folks like me, that's anywhere from 10 million to 100 million people, depending on which estimate you believe. That's a substantial number of Americans that aren't part of this conversation that should be. Why not?
Yeah, some of the motivation on this, Bryan, I try to be, very logic driven, very reasoned. I'm like so many other people who just want answers to questions that we're not getting from the CDC and from, from the administration, quite frankly. The original goal of all of this, when the first messaging for the vaccine rollout was that we need to achieve herd immunity. Do you think that that's still actually the goal? I mean, if we are going to presuppose that, let's take out any of the political pettiness, let's just suppose that everyone is really trying to do the best they can for the good of Americans' health. I don't think herd immunity seems like an objective anymore, do you?
I don't think the current administration, whether you love them or not, knows quite what to do or what their goal might be, other than let's just prevent deaths. And that's a lovely, fantastic goal that we all share. The question is how best to get there. And what we're now seeing with the Delta variant and the vaccine, unfortunately, in some ways, while certainly providing what seems to be, the data says very suggestively, that good protection against severe illness and hospitalization and death as of this moment. So we could celebrate that and should celebrate that. But that means, though, that beyond the therapeutic piece, really, are we actually going to be able to stop people from getting this virus? The answer, even with the vaccine, seems to be no. So if that's true to this herd immunity piece, if in fact most of us are actually either going to get this or have already gotten it, let's just have that conversation, and let's talk about how to protect the most vulnerable of us. And then we're just simply going to have to ride this out until we get a better, more actually effective vaccine that prevents you from getting infected in the first place, or really great therapeutics. And we do have some good news on that front as well. So I do think that there's a lot of hopeful news around this virus and around things like getting to the point of herd immunity. We just need to have that conversation and acknowledgement that unfortunately is where we have to end up. And a lot of folks are going to be hurt in that process. So let's protect who we can, and let's rally around each other and love on each other. And I don't know how much more we can do unless we have some innovation.
Yeah, that's a great point. And those therapeutics, I wish that they were a part of the national conversation as much as they are, I think, in everybody's private conversations, away from Washington, D.C. That's incredibly unfortunate.
Amen.
I wanted to get your thoughts on this situation, for instance, how this plays into it's crazy that we're looking at the pandemic and then we're also looking at border policy. But this has been coming from so many local Texas news outlets, television stations down near the border, near McAllen, Texas, near the Rio Grande Valley. And of course from people who are trying to illegally enter themselves, from border police, and even from Democratic mayors. I mean, these are strong blue Democrat areas. Lindsey Graham came out today with a representative from Texas who was from a strong blue area, and they were all saying that it's really difficult to really believe the sincerity with that the Biden administration and others that they speak with when they talk about being concerned with the pandemic and the Delta variant and the spread, considering that we don't have really any record of testing of anyone coming across the border. We know for a fact that only some are and some aren't. And then just having people be put on, buses and vans and whatever and taken throughout the rest of the country, that seems like that should be a concern for something that is as contagious as chickenpox, as the CDC says, Bryan.
Right. Well, look, I live and work in Southern Virginia, but about a few dozen miles from the border. And I can tell you that in communities like Sierra Vista, Arizona, Sonoyta, Benson, even Tucson, there are people talking about this to say, look, there is a hypocrisy here, isn't there? That we talk about the importance of masking, about social distancing, get your vaccine, talk to your doctor about a very serious virus. And in fact, this is. So we are being told, and indeed, we're all having these very serious conversations. But yet our own government is effectively opening up the border. And what we also have seen, and no doubt you have seen this, folks are getting rid of their passports, their IDs, because their belief is they will be less of a chance of being deported. So not only are we unable to determine who these people are in terms of, say, their terror threat, et cetera, but we don't even have the ability to reach back to their home countries to ask anything about those folks' exposure or involvement in any other kind of potential medical issues or concerns that they might be bringing that virus in addition to other kinds of sicknesses. So this is a very real concern for me as an Arizonan, for my friends, for my neighbors, for military bases like Fort Huachuca down in Sierra Vista, or Davis-Monthan Air Force Base here in Tucson. This is a real issue for a lot of people in places like Arizona, but McAllen, Texas, you were talking about, the bluer areas of Texas, the Rio Grande Valley. There are a lot of Hispanic folks that are saying, hey, you know what? It doesn't matter what color of the person this is coming across the border. If it's illegally, it's wrong for lots of reasons, to include the fact that we, irrespective you might be, are going to be impacted by whatever comes across the border, the criminality, the terror, and yes, the COVID and the medical piece as well. That's not being discussed, and I think a lot of the folks that I speak with are very, very upset by it.
What are your thoughts about Attorney General Merrick Garland threatening to sue Texas Governor Greg Abbott for putting a stop to that transport of those illegal entrants out throughout the rest of the state? I mean, that was pretty shocking, considering he said it was dangerous and unlawful. Interesting choice of words for him.
No, look, here's what's happening. The administration doesn't want a border, and Texas does, and that makes Joe Biden and Merrick Garland very cranky. So if you step back and understand why all this is happening, there's clearly a political calculus that has been made by President Biden and the left saying open borders are good for us politically, more folks the better. Although only certain south of the border that are likely to vote for us, let's prioritize them, because those Cubans, they'll end up getting to Miami and voting for Republicans. So let's just let the other folks come in. So I think that what is very clear at this point is it's very much a political calculus, and that's horrific, because we are playing fire or with fire in terms of who we let in, because we don't know who those folks are. But secondarily, we're remaking the country. And by we, it's not you and I deciding at the ballot box with the representatives who we should or shouldn't let to the country, but it's a bunch of folks in Washington, D.C. who has decided by fiat what our new country should look like and who should be a part of it and the values that they should hold. That is the most absurd piece of all this to me. And I think the governor of Texas recognizes that. A lot of other Republican governors recognize that, and they're saying, enough.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like everybody has whiplash because of the narrative back and forth, because at first we were at everyone get the vaccine, it'll stop you from contracting coronavirus. And then it morphed into, well, maybe it'll reduce your symptoms. And then it morphed into just encourage your your vaccine hesitant friends and family to get it, and then now everyone's a murderer if they don't get it. Now we're at, oh my gosh, the vaccinated were also spreading it. And the crazy thing is you've seen, Brian, you have a discussion about this online. We already had the first, so what this airs on, the first already had their entire YouTube channel frozen once just because I was talking with another medical professional, an actual doctor who is an epidemiologist, and they were discussing the contagiousness of the Delta variant strictly in academic terms, and for a week, the whole account was frozen. People are suspended on Twitter, on YouTube. The guy who was behind, the pioneer behind the mRNA technology, that whole process, that guy ended up having his account suspended on Twitter because he was talking about it. Because as you know, Brian, the people who run YouTube and Twitter are so much more educated than actual, health professionals. So people are being driven to a very, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but man, these people are testing me because they're making me one. What are your thoughts on this?
Oh boy. What is, I think, frustrating for most of us is I do believe that most Americans are pretty reasonable. They want to have a nuanced conversation. They might get excited in the moment or when they're watching TV, but when folks sit back and they want to be thoughtful about their bodies and their health and that of their families and their communities, they're wanting to have a reasoned conversation, and they need information to have that. And then they will discern the truth working with their friends or family and their medical docs and the rest. But how do you do that if the people who control the information tell you just shut up and do what we tell you to do? Don't ask questions. And that's really what we're seeing right now, not just from big tech. We're also seeing that from the President of the United States himself, who is saying, you got to get the vaccine. And if you don't, I'm going to make life miserable for you. All right, he's telling the folks in the military right now, you get the vaccine, problems where you have to go through this series of tests and all the rest of it. This is also the civilian workforce in the military. That's coming down the pike across the board, particularly in blue states, but it's going to be in some red states as well. That's the part that makes me so infuriated, is that we are, the folks in big tech and frankly in Washington, controlling the information, what you can believe, shut up, don't believe anything else. And if you still won't comply, we are going to make your life so miserable until you finally do. That is the definition of tyranny. My God, in this country, we are living it right now. And that should smack everyone into their senses who's actually paying attention, because indeed that is what is happening.
It is. Just listen to the administration and you'll get a little bit of your freedom back. That's what we're being told. Goodness. Bryan Dean Wright, appreciate your voice on this on social and the discussion. And hopefully this won't get frozen on social media. That would be great. Good to see you. Thanks for joining me.
Fingers crossed.
All right, folks, the great state of Tennessee is they're going to stop vaccine outreach to minors after allowing minors to get jabbed without parental consent, which is insane. You got to have you would have to get a permission slip to get your ears pierced, but you can get injected with an mRNA vaccine that hasn't ever been distributed on such a wide scale before? Okay. Representative John Ragan of the Tennessee General Assembly. He joins us next to discuss. Stick around. Black Rifle Coffee Company is a veteran-owned coffee company, and they serve only premium coffee to people who love America. Veteran CEO and founder Evan Hafer, he spent over 7 years on the ground overseas with U.S. Special Forces, is most admittedly not a Marxist, and he was also a CIA contractor. Black Rifle Coffee is committed to Evan's mission of supporting veteran, law enforcement, and first responder causes. So this summer, Black Rifle Coffee Company invites you to stop arguing with people on the internet. Stop arguing with them in the Instagram comments, on Twitter, and on Facebook. Brew yourself the perfect cup of pour-over, or maybe crack open a can of 300 on your next backcountry mission. Whatever, Black Rifle Coffee is here to fuel your way wherever the remaining days of summer take you. So head on over to blackriflecoffee.com/DanaTV to order yours and use code DanaTV at checkout for 20% off your purchase and your first coffee club order. Fuel the rest of your summer with America's coffee, Black Rifle Coffee. Representative John Ragan of the Tennessee General Assembly, love Tennessee, joins us now to talk about how his state was doing vaccine outreach to minors, all while allowing them to get the vaccine without their parents' knowledge. That seems extreme. Thanks for joining us, Representative. Good to see you. I just remember when I was a teenager, I wanted to get my ears pierced. I had to have my mother go with me because she wanted to go with me. She had to drive me, number one. But if you wanted to do that now, you still have to get your parents' permission, but yet you can go and get a vaccine without your parents' knowing about it or even being aware of any of the adverse reactions, et cetera. Tell me about what happened in Tennessee and how you all worked to put a stop to this.
Well, unfortunately, as you pointed out, we had a situation where some members of our health department were advertising to teenagers that they should go get a vaccine and they didn't need to get their parents' permission to do it. Now, let me make it very clear that my colleagues and I are not opposed to vaccines. The idea is that when a child under the age of 18 is getting a medical procedure, they need to be, shall we say, given permission by their guardian or their parent, because quite frankly, we have in our education code, which is Title 49, requirements for even children in school to take aspirin. They have to have parental permission. Therefore, it doesn't make sense that they would be encouraged to get a vaccine that could have potentially life-threatening consequences in some cases without their parents being involved in it at all. Now, there is something called the minor doctor that said they could.
That's and you make up a really good point. Talking to Tennessee lawmaker John Ragan, you bring up a really good point, because in schools, if you want to take aspirin, you want to take a Flintstone vitamin, you have to have parental permission. You have to have a parent or guardian sign off on it. And with something as serious as this, considering not just all the discussion that people are having about it, I mean, obviously, I would imagine that for there to be this pushback against it, parents were pretty vocal in speaking out about not being brought into this decision-making process regarding their minor children.
Oh, you're absolutely right. My current assignment within the legislature is I chair the Joint Government Operations Committee. Last session, I chaired the subcommittee on K through 12 education. And so I was hearing from parents across the state on other issues as well. And when this issue came up, even though I'm no longer the chair of that subcommittee, and I chair a full committee now, I was still getting a lot of input from parents from way up in Northeast Tennessee next to Virginia, all the way down to Memphis. And they were, shall we say, perturbed, and I'm stating that very mildly, for being left out of the loop. And my colleagues in the Senate, we have two committees, government operations committees, one in the House, one in the Senate, and we meet together for joint meetings. When we do, Senator Roberts chairs 1 month and I chair the next month in the joint committee, so that we operate as a combined body. And he was getting similar inputs as well. So from that standpoint, we had some very strong input from across the state.
Yeah, I can imagine. And Tennessee, of course, I've seen, we have some friends who've recently moved to Tennessee, and they're telling me how outspoken parents there have been. I wanted to get your thoughts too about just some of how difficult it is from your perspective as a lawmaker, because obviously in a time like this, when everyone has questions about vaccine rollout, and they have questions about efficacy and questions about natural immunity, et cetera, we live in the greatest era of information, but yet I don't ever recall a time in my life where it has been so difficult to get a straight answer or just good data, not contradictory from the federal government. And obviously, being right there and working with Tennessee constituents, I want you to talk just tell us what, from your perspective, how has that been for state lawmakers to try to address the needs of their constituents when you're dealing with, we got contradictory data, contradictory statements from the people who are most responsible and closest to the vaccine and the rollout of the vaccine. How confusing has that been for you and other lawmakers?
Well, a little bit less so for me, in that I made a living in statistics, and some of my clients included United Healthcare and Merck Sharp and Dome. So I was familiar with the scientific world of medical measurements and measurement systems. So personally, I had a little less problem with it, but the average person is not familiar at all with measurement concepts like precision and accuracy and false positives and false negatives. So it's very confusing for them to even talk about how good was the measurement system that was giving information about the infection rates, and then again, what they were calling cases. Operational definitions of a case used to be someone who had a positive test and had symptoms. But then all of a sudden we had cases, well, they're asymptomatic, but they've got a positive test. Well, the obvious question that pops to mind is, well, how good was the test? What kind of false positive rate did they have? That was information that wasn't put out until many months after I asked the question. Our own state health department dodged it when I asked them the first time, and then they flat out refused to answer it the second time. And it wasn't until about, I think, 5 or 6 months later that CDC finally put out an estimate. Their estimate was 6%. I did some digging on my own on that, because that used to be my field of employment, and found out that depending on where you went, for example, there was one test that was run in China on this one, and they had as high as a 38% false positive rate. In other cases, I saw 28 and 16% false positives. Now, the bad news about that is if you have a false positive, you have somebody quarantined unnecessarily, and that creates stress on the individual. But it has a tremendous negative impact on economies and education, because anybody that tested positive was quarantined, and that put them in a situation to work or go to school, and our state, our country suffered.
Yeah, it did. And I don't know, boy, I know that we keep hearing rumblings of something like that maybe coming from Washington, D.C. again, which thankfully a lot of these governors are standing up to it. Tennessee Representative John Ragan, it's good to talk with you, and thanks for your transparency. And I'm glad that your constituents had someone that understood how to go through this data there in office. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Dana. I appreciate you having me on.
Of course. Of course. All right, folks, coming up, we take a little bit of a deeper look into Attorney General Merrick Garland's threats to sue Texas over the border and infected illegal entrants. Keep it here. So as you know, the greatest threat to America at the moment is the Delta variant. It's so frightening and so deadly that you have to put your mask on again, even outside, says the Surgeon General. And in your homes with your kids, apparently, too. I'm not kidding. So in-person learning now could be up in the air. There's talk of more lockdowns, meaning vaccinated citizens could be confined to their homes or to some sort of limited mobility, because apparently the Delta is that serious, that deadly. It's a game changer, don't you know? Which is why, in order to beat the spread of the Delta variant, the Biden administration has done something super powerful and yet unexpected. Flung the borders wide open to allow illegal entrants to flood in, many of them infected with coronavirus. So, as it turns out, our nation's laws apparently only apply to citizens. People who aren't citizens do not have to obey the law, which is a neat trick. So you have to be tested for the coronavirus to work at the post office. But if you enter the country illegally and you come across the border and you don't even have to be tested, or even if you are, it doesn't matter. You're bussed in, you're given a hotel room, you're taken to further in the interior to places like La Jolla, Texas, and placed in communities, even though those people that they're placing have been, and in fact, local news has confirmed a lot of these instances, confirmed contraction, positive cases with the coronavirus, which could be the Delta variant. Why would the federal government do this? You're probably wondering. Why would you mask your citizens? Which, by the way, people receive tickets for not wearing a mask. They've been arrested for this stuff. Why would you make your citizens do this and talk mandated vaccines? And many companies are doing just that to their employees. But then you do nothing to anybody who's coming across the border who is testing positive, and in fact, place them in communities, and they're just like going out and about. And in fact, in one town in southern and near the border in Texas, police were called because someone was talking to a group of people who had come in from across the border, and they were just out and about, and they'd said, yeah, they'd actually tested positive, and that person flipped out and called the police. So these are all really good questions. It's almost like they want America to get sick. I mean, I'm just, speculating here. It's kind of like when Dr. Fauci didn't want Trump to stop inbound flights from China, and he said that it wouldn't make a difference, and then they all said that Trump was racist. But then Biden just did this, he just did the same thing. Okay, in any case, Governor Greg Abbott of Texas, he signed an executive order to stop the transport of people who are coming across the border illegally, to transport them and put them up in hotels, because when anyone who wants to actually protect citizens and do their job with national security, That's exactly what you should do, right? You would do that, or you would remove them from their job. But the Biden administration, their action seems to indicate that they prefer that illegal entrants over their own citizens. They'll let people who are coming across the border do whatever. Citizens, no. They're threatening now Governor Abbott with an order from Merrick Garland, Attorney General. Here is some of that. It says, quote, "This order," then they're talking about Greg Abbott's executive order, "would jeopardize the health and safety of non-citizens in federal government custody, federal law enforcement personnel and their families and communities, among other harms." And this is what Merrick Garland's accusing Abbott of, "this order would exacerbate and prolong overcrowding in facilities, shelters, obstruct the federal government's arrangements with states, non-governmental partners to ensure that released individuals are transported for appropriate blah, blah, blah," the end. Oh, for the love. So there you have it. So the logic from the Biden administration and DOJ's Merrick Garland is that the Delta variant will spread in overcrowded facilities and shelters filled with people who entered the country illegally. So the solution is to just let them do what they want. Put them up in a hotel, you ignorant bigot. Now, you would think if you cared about anybody's lives, that after this very deadly variant that we're all talking about locking down the country again for, if you cared about American lives, one thing you might do is maybe deploy the National Guard to the border to help out with Border Patrol, because there aren't enough Border Patrol agents, and the ones that are there are now also apparently contracting coronavirus and testing positive. You know, do what they did, do what Democrats did with the Capitol, right? They had all those National Guard members there. How many people? They had like thousands of them. And they had an 8-foot wall, by the way, one of those horribly bigoted, racist walls. They like putting up walls for their own protection, but they're against erecting them on the border for you. See how that works? So when the federal government ceases to take appropriate actions to safeguard its citizens, a state government should step in, and it did. Governor Greg Abbott did that in Texas, and maybe that's the lesson here. Red states, just as blue states did during the Trump years, maybe it's time to declare yourself all kinds of sanctuary states. Sanctuaries from stupid, irresponsible, and completely reckless federal government policies. I mean, just think about it. If you were to go out of the country and come back in and you tested positive, you would be disallowed entry. But if you snuck over the Rio Grande and did it, you'd be put on a bus and taken to a hotel, and then just let to go wherever you wanted to go. Wow. That does it for us tonight. Thanks for tuning in. Good night, and don't bend the knee.